Good morning. My name is Shonda, and here is my week 1 answer for mutual threat perceptions between the Western world and the Islamic world. Are they realistic or exaggerated? I think that they're both. Muslim threat perception of the westernized world is much higher than the Western world's threat perception of Muslims, I think. Muslims are aware of their history dating back to pre-Islamic times. They are aware of the conflict and strife that has plagued their region for millenniums and treat that conflict as modern-day activity. This history is the basis for the hostility as well as the current threat perception felt for the westernized world as a whole. The Muslim perception of the Western world began during medieval times and possibly even before then. Our book kind of delves into a little bit of that and goes back to medieval times. Islamic region was the most advanced civilization in the world. It was the richest, most powerful, and most creative, as well as the most enlightened region. And of course, it being as successful as it was, put the westernized nations on the defensive. And not just the westernized nations, but Christianity and Christendom. And in turn, brought force and fear, as well as threat from the West. The strife began during times, like I said, of the Reconquista and the Crusades and medieval times. During the Crusades, Westerners tried to take back the Middle East and the birthplace of Christ by force. Of course, that brought along threat and fear. They failed, but the damage was done. In 1918, the last of great Muslim empires was defeated. Constantinople, the capital of Ottoman Sultanate, became an occupied territory and was subsequently divided by Britain and France. Then, after the invasion and division of the Middle Eastern region, the Sultanate was abolished in 1922. So not only are we taking their lands and dividing them, I shouldn't say we, but Western culture is not just taking their lands and dividing them and moving them and shuffling them around, but they're also taking over religious beliefs, abolishing sultanates and caliphs, and trying to bring in Christendom and the Western way of thinking and forcing it upon the Middle Eastern Islamic world. The Sultan was not only the ruler of the state, but he was also head of all Sunni Islam, so that brought on a Sunni reaction. Muslim perception of the West was born. The West was seen as a threat, and it only got worse. When America came into the picture, it was not really considered a political symbol in the Islamic world until 1793, and then it was only seen as a land composed of regions assembled as one republic in the land of North America and inhabited by tribes who had been freed from the English. But the early 20th century brought more attention to the United States in Muslim newspapers and textbooks and encyclopedias. And, by the way, these newspapers and textbooks and encyclopedias were really a westernized idea. That was a European idea that was brought into the Muslim culture, into the Islamic culture. There really wasn't a whole lot of writing or textbooks or anything like that prior to Europe. If I remember correctly, I'm taking that off the top of my head instead of my written notes. This attention that was given to the United States was neither really positive nor negative, but again, with time, that all changed. Islamic nation clung to anti-Western movements such as Hitler and the Third Reich, and later to the Soviet Union, thinking that through Allied help through these entities or these beliefs or regions, that they could dominate over the Western powers that had come in and taken their lands, and they could retake their lands and regain their dominance in the world and teach their Islamic ways. But during World War II, Middle Eastern oil was brought to the United States, and of course when oil was brought, wealth came with it, as well as success and power. Excuse me. Wealth, success, and power are seen as sins and crimes in the Muslim world. So, of course, when the United States gained all of these things, we were automatic enemies of God, and in turn enemies of Islam. And of course, with the fall of the Soviet Union, that left the United States as a sole world superpower. So again, not only are we now enemies of God and enemies of Islam because we're wealthy and successful and powerful, but we're also infidels, and or well, that is enemies of God. So sorry, I misspoke there. Um, but the United States automatically became an arch enemy of the Muslim region, changing their perception in the United States from one of no threat, or the United States is nothing more than a territory in a region made up of a bunch of different tribes and a bunch of different people living in the same place. But now there's the perception, or at that time there was a perception, that the United States, oh my gosh, they're terrible, they're infidels, they're going to come take our lands, they're going to try to change our way of thinking. So the threat perception increased at that point. The United States presence was seen as this led to a resentment of Americans by the Muslim community. Many Muslims define the enemy in religious terms and see the Americans as infidels, invaders, occupiers, and they still do. Some Muslims see the United States as the Great Satan. We've heard that time and again in different writings and different speakings, and even in our own books, that we're referred to as the Great Satan. The Islamic faith depicts Satan as neither an imperialist nor an exploiter, but as a seducer and a tempter who, quote, whispers in the hearts of men. What threat is greater to a religious civilization like Islam than Satan? What's worse than an exploiter and a seducer and a tempter to move these people away from their religious and historical backgrounds and into modernization? Westerners are often perceived as destroyers of the Islamic faith for this reason. And that's due to their past actions, their historical behavior, and their present day behavior as well. This history gave birth to the common threat perception of the Islamic world toward the West and the United States. Their past is their present in Islam, and their present will be their future as well. So their past is their present and will be their future. They never forget anything that's happened in their past, and it's always brought into their present and future way of thinking. It's just their culture. Their threat perception of the West, and more specifically the United States, is not exaggerated, I don't think, because of the historically rooted traditions in the Islamic culture. They're historically minded people, and we have historically brought death and destruction to their region. Why would they not feel threatened? They will pass these perceptions based upon actions of the Western world 600 years ago, and the memory of what the United States is doing in their region now, on to their future generations, and those generations will pass them on to their future generations, and so forth and so on. I don't foresee Islam or the Muslims being any different. I think that they will always be historically minded, and they will carry on to future generations everything that's going on now. I wouldn't say so much that they're going to carry their hatred, but it's almost like they hold a grudge and they're never going to forget that. But that's their culture. It's not a personal choice. It's something that's ingrained in them. They'll never forget the hatred felt for them, and they will never forget the forceful response and ultimate occupation of their region, past and present. As a traditional historical people, their perception will be altered for generations to come. The Muslim threat perception of the U.S. is higher now than ever before, and I think for good reason. We claim that we're liberating them and freeing their people, but we've attacked their region. We've occupied their lands for the last 11 years with no real sign of leaving anytime soon. We've asked that they abandon their traditions and take up pieces of our culture to reform their broken country, such as governments and different things. We may make a difference, and we may eventually provide a better, freer, economically stable life for the Middle East, but their perception of us will never change. There will always be that threat and that worry that we're going to go back as we did in history and betray them again when there's grandeur and money to be made on that betrayal. For the United States, I think threat perception of the Islamic world is a little different. For one, it's not historically rooted. Westerners and United States in specifically are not in tune with events that took place 100 years ago, more or less events that took place 1,000 years ago. And even if we are in tune with events that took place that long ago, we don't intermingle that with the present. We don't say, oh, well, you attacked us 100 years ago, now we hate you, and we're not ever going to forgive you for it. So there's no historical basis for the hostility and threat perception of Muslim nations and people to our culture. Our perception of the Middle East is much more currently drawn prior to, say, like the 9/11 threat perception. Prior to 9/11, threat perception was borderline to non-existent. I know for me personally, I never thought about, the Middle East or well, are they going to attack us, or do they hate us, or what are they going to do to our country? I never thought about that. And why would the Western world fear a people in a nation or a region that had been conquered time and time and time and time again? Why would great superpowers of the world feel threatened by economically and militarily inferior regions? And then, of course, the attacks during 9/11 on the United States completely changed that nonchalant perception. Americans were bullied on their own playground. They were bullied into perceiving Muslims and the Middle Eastern region as a real threat. Americans, including our government, I think, never really thought about the Middle East and its people as a threat. Like I said, I know I didn't. However, after the attacks, there was a new and tremendous fear of what they may do and how, what they may do, when they may do it again, and how they would do it. America really went on the defensive and took preemptive actions to ensure no future attacks. The American threat perception of Muslims in the wake of 9/11 was extremely exaggerated. We as a nation accused an entire region for the actions of a select few. As I saw in one of our texts for the reading, I'm not sure if it was for this class or another one that I have, but there was a point made that not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. And it only takes a few terrorists to make a huge noise, and it only takes a very small time to make that huge noise heard around the world. So, of course, in the wake of 9/11, our threat perception of the Muslim world and of the Arab region, Islam, was extremely exaggerated. But I think that in contrast to the Muslims, our threat perception of them will drastically reduce in time, and I think it already has to an extent. I don't think that we feel as threatened, but our guard remains up. And at this point, we've settled back to a reasonable level of threat and fear. That feeling of oh my gosh, what are they going to do? I mean, our guard is up. We haven't forgotten them, but we're not on the verge of just total full-out fear. Like I said, our threat perception, or our overall perception of the Muslims, will never be as laissez-faire as it was prior to 9/11. So that's my post for this week, and I look forward to our dialogue with each other. Thanks.